What is up, everybody? Welcome to another video from the Geek Pantheon, and today I wanted to talk to you about encounter design, and specifically 5 things that I think can really help when you're designing encounters to make them feel more dynamic, cinematic, and overall just more fun. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, if you want to be part of the conversation surrounding this video, head on over to our Facebook group, The Geek Pantheon. We are also on Twitter and Instagram at The Geek Pantheon. And we also have a Patreon, patreon.com/The Geek Pantheon, which is the place to go to for all of our content. Everything shows up there, regardless of whether or not it's just for our patrons or for everybody. So that's definitely the place to go to keep up with what we're working on. But now to the video. So 5 things to help with your encounter design. Now, the first one that I want to talk about is make space. If most of your encounters, especially indoor encounters, are taking place in a 30-foot by 30-foot room, that's not going to be too exciting, and it gives a huge advantage to the melee focused characters, both on the PC and the monster side, because it's impossible for anybody to get outside of melee range for more than a turn. They're going to be able to just get chased around the room the whole time. So my metric, typically what I try to hold myself to, I do not have a 100% success rate by any stretch of the imagination, but what I try to do is ensure that at least one dimension of the room, either width or length, is 60 feet long, because that will allow, as the DM, my monsters, but also the more ranged focused or spell casting PCs to put some distance between themselves and the more melee focused characters, and be able to avoid them. Now, if you're dealing with like a 60-foot long hallway that's only 5 feet, then yeah, you're gonna get cornered. But allowing a more dynamic, wide space is going to allow for everybody to get a chance to shine and keep some distance between themselves and the threats present. And it's definitely great for you too, because the PCs can keep their distance, but so can your monsters. If you have a lich that is trying to cast spells, if they're crammed into a 30-foot by 30-foot room, it's going to be real easy for one of the PCs to just devastate them, and they're not going to have a clear escape route. Believe me, I know. Go check out Eberron Renewed, our actual play podcast. I'll drop a link down in the description for you, but I've been there, and you don't want that to happen. So by creating these bigger spaces for your monsters to operate in, you give them options that the PCs can't just flood them in a small enclosed space. The bigger you make it, the more dynamic that combat's going to feel. Now, the second thing I want to talk to you about is make it tall. So we just addressed the X and Y axis, but what about the Z axis? So often I see both dungeon masters and players get very flummoxed as soon as a flying entity enters a combat, because we spend so little time thinking about the Z axis and the height and what's above us. And that's a shame, because there are so many creatures and so many PC abilities that allow us to use the Z axis. So if you have a creature that has spider walk, let them use it. Let them get on the ceiling and shoot down. That's going to be so cool and frustrating for the party. Except this allows your ranged characters to shine. So many combats are melee characters rush up, ranged characters stay back, everybody fires at the same thing, and move on. By putting monsters in inaccessible areas for your melee characters, you then make the party reliant on your ranged characters. So you're giving them a chance to shine at doing something that party members that typically can do a lot more damage in combat can't accomplish. You reward them for not just hitting it with a big stick. By incorporating catwalks, inaccessible ledges, creatures that can walk on any surface, you're creating this dynamic flow of combat where the party is having to be just as aware of what's above them as what's in front of them. By having a window with a small balcony and no visible staircase, but there's a cultist with a bow and arrow shooting down at the party, you're giving your other PCs a chance to shine. Now, I'm not saying to only do that and have your barbarian standing there just... Give them something to do. Have things down on ground level for your melee characters to wallop on, but then give threats that only your ranged characters can deal with. And you're going to have a party that's fully engaged in combat and thinking about their next move. Okay, the next tip I have for you, fill it with stuff. Now, this can be difficult for a lot of dungeon masters like myself who like to play in the theater of the mind, but it's easy to get around, and I'll get into that in a second. But primarily, whether it's using maps, drawing your own maps and environments, put stuff in there. Crates, torches, braziers, anything you can think of that makes sense in that space, put it there. Chandelier hanging from the ceiling, iconic D&D stuff. Now, If you're like me and you don't utilize maps and you don't draw your own maps or anything like that, it's just all by description, it would take me over an hour to describe everything that's in my room in the level of detail needed for a player to feel confident in a sense of what's available for them. So what I like to do is make it clear to my players that if you suggest that something is in the room that makes sense, I'm going to go there with you. If the party is fighting in a warehouse and one of the player characters looks around and says, I want to find a stack of crates to dive behind, how close are they? That's totally reasonable that there would be a stack of crates, probably a lot of stacks of crates in this warehouse. So 10 feet away, you can take a couple of steps and you're there. And they're able to dive behind it, take cover, and it feels interesting. Just like if the party is fighting in a gala for some reason, and the rogue says, I want to grab a painting off the wall next to me and smash it over their head. You're in a gala. Yeah, it makes sense there would be paintings everywhere. Grab that painting, go nuts. So as a dungeon master, allow your party and your players the ability to fill the space with stuff, because that space is going to feel so much more lived in and so much more dynamic because you're allowing the party to write the narrative along with you, as long as it makes sense. If you're in a dungeon crawl and the fighter says, I want to run up and shoulder into the brazier right by the cultist and send coals flying up into their face. Yeah, that thing would be in this place. So let them do it. It's fun, it's unique, and it will create memorable encounters for your party. Number 4 is unique environments. Now, what I'm talking about when I say unique environments is stone floors, wooden doors, forests, the typical environments that we have D&D encounters in can get tiresome. Not saying do away with them altogether, obviously, but especially for the big moments, it's so much cooler if you make something unique for them to fight in as opposed to just another big stone room. Like, for example, having a combat encounter that takes place on a series of runaway wagons, or if you're setting laws for it, a train, requires so little additional prep for you as a dungeon master and takes virtually no extra headspace to run, but is so much cooler and so much memorable from a player standpoint. You still have the dimensions of the room, which is the top of the train, and you still have the monsters that you're moving around. Nothing's changed except you've added this environmental hazard that the players can knock somebody off of the train, which is cool, and it doesn't require anything of you. Just let the monster make the dexterity saving throw to catch themselves. If they fail, bye-bye. It's not a big thing. But in your player's mind, it's going to be so much more interesting and so much more cool to fight on top of a train or a series of runaway wagons. That's so much cooler than stone room, wood doors, castle in a forest. Or another option is they're going to stop the Archmage's ritual. And once they get within 60 feet of the magic circle that's the center of this ritual, all of a sudden, gravity is halved. And so the player character's walking speed is halved, but they gain a jumping speed of double their walking speed. So you have people hopping all over the environment, and you can't attack people halfway through your movement, but it creates something different and interesting, and your player's gonna be like, what? Okay. So I'm gonna jump, and if I were running it, depending on the party and depending on the nature of the situation, I might make them make acrobatics checks to see how well they can gauge how far they're gonna jump, or athletics checks. Maybe for the first couple of rounds, and then by the third round, it's okay, you've gotten a feel for it now, so you can hop around reasonably and say, okay, I want to jump 50 feet that way. Okay. But the first round of combat, saying, okay, they're only 40 feet away from me, so I want to just try to do a quarter jump and just jump to them. And it's okay, make me an athletics roll. And they roll a 2, and it's okay, you fly the full distance way past them, and you're just crap. Okay, I'm going to throw a spear then. So you can create a really interesting combat encounter that I think most players are really going to enjoy and find interesting and not run-of-the-mill. And the last one that I have for you is to account for diverse skill sets. This is something that I need to get better about as a dungeon master, and I see a lot of dungeon masters that neglect this side of the game. Create elements of an encounter that can be solved by non-combat skills. Your group is going to love you for this. So what I'm thinking is, in the Archmage that we just talked about with the half grab, maybe the cultists have started having second thoughts about destroying the world, and they're just I don't know if I want to be here right now. give the face of the party a chance to make one last persuasion check to get them to either turn on the Archmage or just beat feet out of there. And that will allow the face of the party, who probably isn't the best person in combat, to have an awesome moment of like, whoa, you just took out half of the enemy combatants with one check. That's awesome. Or the ancient ritual is obviously fueled by magic. So instead of casting spells, maybe while the Archmage is distracted by the barbarian in their face hitting them with an axe, the wizard can run around to the arcane circle and start doing an arcana check to try and figure out what they need to do to stop this ritual from happening. But all that to say, giving the party things to accomplish in a normally combat heavy situation that allows them to rely on their non-combat skills accomplishes two things. Firstly, it will give your non-combat focused player characters a chance to shine in normally combat heavy moments. And D&D is at its core a combat first system. 90% of the rules deal with combat. And so as Dungeon Masters, part of our job then becomes to find ways to make it interesting for non-combat focused characters. Because at its core, D&D is a combat focused system. Most of its rules are designed to deal with combat. And so as Dungeon Masters, it falls onto our shoulders to find ways to engage with players who want to create something that's not combat focused, without telling them go play a different system, because that's not helpful. And if that's what you want to say, you're not helping anybody. Find a way to allow them to shine in the game as it exists. And by introducing these non-combat focused things in the big end of the campaign fight, that's going to be so much more interesting and make them feel validated for investing so heavily in charisma-based skills or dexterity-based skills. It's going to create a love of the game because they feel like they're contributing, even in a scenario where it would normally be reserved for the barbarian or the fighter or the rogue. Well, a stabby rogue, not a tinker rogue. Secondly, it's going to create this awesome, frantic sense of tension where some characters, like the wizard, are going to have to make a decision between casting Fireball or doing an arcane check to try and stop the ritual. Because if you make it clear as the Dungeon Master that this ritual needs to be stopped, like things are happening and things are going to get worse the longer this combat goes on. And so you can't rely on waiting until after the Archmage is dead to then deal with this. You create decisions. You create moments where the players really have to think and weigh their options and make a meaningful choice. And as a Dungeon Master, that gives you something to work with. Does the wizard decide to cast Fireball? Like, I'm going to focus on combat. We can deal with that after the fight. Okay, what new environmental effect on top of the half gravity is now going to be introduced because the wizard decided to not deal with the magic? Because it's their choice. You just deal with the consequences. So anyway, let me know what you think. Were these helpful? Are you going to implement them at your table? I think that they're a lot of help and able to create unique, dynamic, cinematic, interesting combat encounters that can equate to more than I stand there and swing. And that's kind of the name of the game for me, is trying to create these moments where everybody at the table feels like they're contributing, like they're valuable, and they have great stories to tell each other years down the line once this campaign is concluded. So let me know what you think. Did I miss anything? Do you have any tips for me on how to create better combat encounters? Let me know down in the comments, and maybe I'll make another one of these. 5 more tips on how to create combat encounters based on your suggestions. And please be sure to give a like to the video. It helps so much for a channel trying to grow like ours is. And also be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos. And if you want to join our amazing Patreon community, you can head on over to patreon.com/thegeekpantheon and hop onto our Discord server, meet everybody. We would love to have you there. Anyway, thank you so much, and I will see you next time.